All right, so we're going into that territory of Out of Babylon by Walter Bruggemann, a book that was published in 2010. Bruggemann is an OG of Old Testament theology, and he's written so many books that one can't even count them all. But one thing I can tell you is that he's very much into close textual analysis, but he's also willing to take leaps that allow us to see the significance of these otherwise kind of obscure or specific historical texts. And so he is not afraid to put his own stamp on this reading. And this particular book starts out with a look at Babylon in the book of Jeremiah. But before we get to a little bit about what he thought of Babylon and what he says about Babylon, I just want to give people heads up as to the significance of this and why it is that somebody who's interested in political philosophy could be interested in this particular line of thinking. Okay, and it's because of this leap that Bruggemann makes. And he's very famous for doing this. This is really the signature Bruggemann move, right? And the gift that he has to give us is that he takes his study of Old Testament theology and he applies it to contemporary circumstances, in particular circumstances of the United States, okay? And so, for instance, he says it's no new thing to suggest that the contemporary United States mirrors ancient Babylon in its totalizing propensity. But it probably is kind of a new thing to a lot of people. And it's not a new thing now to people who know about this, but it's a new thing to most people, and maybe particularly to people in the United States who consider themselves to be fairly serious Christians. But there's parallels here, and part of this book a big part of this book is about drawing those parallels. So just as another heads up as to what he's going to be about, he says, Christians in the United States are accustomed to read the Bible in a democratic context, where we have political religious freedom guaranteed by the Constitution, or even more, to read the Bible with the United States cast in the role of God's chosen people and carrier of God's will for freedom in the world. An exceptionalism that pervades our public discourse. Such a reading becomes a very difficult matter, however, when the facts on the ground exhibit the United States as empire, as the place for faithful reading and faithful living according to an alternative loyalty that is in deep tension with the totalizing claims of empire. So right there, he's like set up really the dichotomy that runs throughout this book is that there's empire and its totalizing attempts. In other words, its attempts to control everything, to dominate everything. And then there's this localized loyalty, right? In the Old Testament, that is placed in the people of Israel. But there's this localized loyalty, which in the United States one might find in faithful Christians, right? That, if there's a parallel, runs counter to empire, just as in the Old Testament, in the book of Jeremiah, there's this counter empire narrative, right, that resists the goals and the power of empire and tries to stay true to the word of Yahweh, right? So to today, Bruggemann's view is, in the United States, the current imperial power, Christians need to stay true to the word of Yahweh, okay? And that oftentimes the empire is so totalitarian or totalizing that it occludes the ability of Christians to be able to even see their true situation. So as far as Babylon goes, in the first chapter, he really zeroes in on the book of Jeremiah and the Babylonian captivity, when Babylon takes over Jerusalem, and there's this mass, taking of people out of Jerusalem. All right. So as far as Babylon goes, he says, for instance, just to characterize its power, Babylon was a very ancient kingdom with advanced cultural and scientific learning. It experienced an important revival in the 6th century with the founding of a new dynasty. In the 7th century, Babylon had been subordinated to the powerful kingdom of Assyria, but in 626 BCE, Nabopolassar, together with important allies, broke free from Assyria, established an independent kingdom, and in 20 years displaced Assyria as the dominant regional power. Okay, and so Babylon becomes this powerful empire, and it becomes, in Jeremiah, not only the specific powerful empire that has to be resisted by faithful people, but it becomes this symbol of empire for Bruggemann more generally. Now, as to how they dealt with the people of Israel as they took Jerusalem, he said it was the policy of the Babylonians to reduce conquered people to acquiescent colonies by the stratagem of deporting the leadership class who might have mounted resistance to such occupations and relocating that elite population elsewhere, which is what they did. But interestingly, and this is something I wasn't aware of, I'm not a biblical scholar, that's why I read this stuff, is that many people were left behind. They didn't mind leaving behind the poor who had no ability to resist them. And those poor continued to worship at the temple and carry on the Torah tradition. So from one point of view, the people who were left were the most faithful and most conforming to the will of Yahweh, interestingly. But for the rest of the people, the question was, now that we're like under Babylonian control, what should our position be to this empire? Now, we may have to submit, but do we have to conform to the values and support the agenda of the empire? And if we don't, what price do we pay, and are we willing to pay it? So this becomes the crucible, you might say, that not only is faced by the Israelites at that point in time, but is faced, according to Bruggemann, by Christians today in dealing with empire, which is a cold and brutal word and thing. And the more that we contemplate it, the more so it becomes as we read this book. So as the Babylonian captivity is described here, for instance, Bruggemann says the destruction and deportation of the Jews were the will and the work of Yahweh. Okay, now here he's describing the Jews' reaction as we see it in the book of Jeremiah and moving forward, right? They viewed this incident, this huge disaster for Jerusalem and the people of Israel, as the work of Yahweh, because they came with a preordained point of view about how to view history. And I would venture that this is a point of view that we've largely lost, which is that they interpreted events through the lens that God is actually in control of the world. And I would challenge people who believe that God is actually in control of the world to think about this consistently and ask yourself what it would mean if you actually asked yourself if God is in control of the world and events. Because back then it meant that even if empire took over your people and decimated them, that there must have been a reason for that ordained by God, because God ultimately is in control. So Bruggemann basically says that this is the way that they looked at this. not to just blame Babylon, but rather to blame themselves, because the issue was there must have been a lack of fidelity and loyalty to Yahweh. Yahweh had kind of punished them, had turned his back on them, at least for the time being, because of disobedience. And so he says it is because the Torah had been intolerably violated, and thus Nebuchadnezzar can be understood as at most a tool and an agent of Yahweh or God. Or as Jeremiah asserts, Nebuchadnezzar is Yahweh's servant. This is very reminiscent of, this is the roots of what came later as Christianity developed all throughout the Middle Ages. There was this idea of rulership that was dominating or that punished people or was authoritarian as the scourge of God. When the barbarians came through, when Attila the Hun came through, he was the scourge of God. He was God's punishment. So it wasn't that Attila was in control, see, it was God that was in control. So they saw the events as, like to a certain extent, there's rationale here, there's reason here, right? The events, if God is in control, must be some sort of message from God. And this is how the Israelites saw it, okay? So he says it became the tenacious work of the community of Jews in Babylon to maintain their distinct identity as Jews, to practice the kind of Torah obedience that had not been practiced in Jerusalem, and to keep hope alive for the end of displacement and the return to the land. So their reaction was, well, we have to double down on our obedience and loyalty to Yahweh, to God. And because this is our only hope of any sort of restoration. So we start to see themes emerging here in Bruggemann's book. Exile and return is a major theme. Punishment and salvation, you might say. Empire as a scourge of God, right? But also, he says, empire is a challenge to the rule of God, and it can be both. Empire can be used by God according to this Old Testament way of thinking, but at the same time, empire is made up of human beings who are in no way wanting to obey God. In fact, quite the opposite. And therefore, they are also constantly challenging God's rule and being an affront to it. Okay. Bruggemann says, if one were Babylonian, the empire's success would have been the source of uncommon deposit of wealth, privilege, and entitlement guaranteed by the military agency of Babylon, an agency that ensured a reliable flow of capital to the city. So from the Babylonians' point of view, it would be difficult, if not impossible, for them to imagine that they were really the tools of God, a God who wanted to punish the Israelites and wanted to assert his power over creation, right, to show that he was in charge. It would have been very difficult for them to see that. Their sight would be occluded by their very success, by their worldly success, by their wealth, privilege, entitlement, military power, and their reliable flow of capital that just kept on coming. So Bruggemann says Babylon was a hegemonic power whose goal was to be all-defining for life in the world. Okay. Which we tend to associate more with totalitarian ideologies starting in the 20th century and going forward, perhaps. But here he's saying even back then, the goal of the hegemonic power of empire was to do more than just control territory and things. It was to control people, including people's minds, the way that they thought. And he says it is the work of such hegemonic power, empire, to exercise total government control, and where possible, total economic and cultural control as well. Empires like Babylon lack both patience and tolerance towards those whose ultimate loyalty belongs to someone or something other than empire itself. In response to such loyalties, the empire will move beyond total control into totalitarian final solutions. The threat of not agreeing with empire is perhaps annihilation. And that fear is what kept people in Babylon from being able to see beyond the illusion of their wealth and power to the power of God and the ultimate resolution of events. And so I think part of Bruggemann, what Bruggemann is foretelling here, is that all empires face this. All empires face this delusion. And the United States is no exception. That most people will see the empire as in agreement with God's plan. Okay? And while God may use empire to scourge or to punish others for disobedience, God is not simply the mind of empire. In other words, if you are a resident of an imperial power, you should not think that because you scourge or are a curse to others, that you yourself are blessed. And this is the mistake that people always make when they occupy the imperial seat. But there is no one, according to this Torah, as he puts it, this Torah way of looking at the world, there is no one who is in charge other than Yahweh or God, not the empire. And the fundamental mistake that imperial powers make is to think that they are. So the next chapter is even more challenging. I hope you guys will be along for this ride. It has most things I deal with. Not a cheery matter. I am not particularly a cheery person. Get used to it. All right. I'll see you next week. Bye.